This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. I am the director of the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University, and I am also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Thank you for joining us. Well, questions have been raised about the teaching of humanities and politics and history and civics on our college campuses. It's said that many professors in these subjects are telling their students that racism is pervasive in the United States. It counts for the large number of Black Americans incarcerated in American prisons. The professors say that Israel is not a legitimate country and that a woman has an inviolate right to choose whether or not to have an abortion. And what's really, the critics say that only one side is being taught. And these are complex questions, but only one side is being taught. Well, it's hard to know whether these allegations are true because college professors have extraordinary autonomy once they close their door to their classroom. They teach as they please. They pick their own textbooks. They make up their own reading lists. Professors love this. I love this. I mean, it's a great thing to be a professor because you have so much freedom. You're so much ability to do what you think is best for your students. So there's a lot of good things about this, but it makes it difficult for outsiders to figure out, well, what's being taught in those classrooms. Now, Jon Shields, a professor at Claremont McKenna College, and his colleagues have figured out a way to see into that deep black hole. They have dug into the files assembled by the Open Syllabus project, which stores data on syllabuses. And I'm very pleased to have Jon Shields with me on the Education Exchange today. Jon, thank you for joining me.
Paul, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, Jon, we'll get to your methods in a second, but first tell me, what was the main purpose of your inquiry? What did your colleagues and you decide that you would try to figure out?
Thanks, Paul, for the good question. It's great to be here. All concerned that college education has become more sectarian in recent years. And that's a problem, we think, because insofar as that's true, that undermines really the purpose of liberal education, one of which is to form citizens. Citizens need a kind of a fluency with the issues and controversies that divide us. And they need to develop the capacity to think about them in critical and thoughtful ways. And we think that's especially true in a moment when America has become deeply polarized over questions like Israel-Palestine, race in the criminal justice system, and abortion. And so we wanted to get a richer sense of whether or not professors are indeed teaching these issues in sectarian ways as we feared, or to what degree is that wrong? In truth, we came into this thinking that our findings would be somewhat discouraging. When we started this research, we thought, well, we're likely to find some imbalance in college teaching on these issues. But in fact, we found that in fact the situation is much worse than we.
What's clever about your study is the way in which you find out information from the Open Syllabus project. Mm-hmm. So I need to ask you, what is the Open Syllabus project?
Yeah, good question. It's a database of college syllabi that most of which are scraped from the web. It includes millions of them, and they date as far back as the 1990s, but most are more recent than that. And the database doesn't provide all the raw data to scholars, but it provides a very useful searchable database. So, for example, you can go and see what are the most commonly assigned text in these courses. But more importantly, for our purposes, you can also see what are they assigned with, right? So you can identify the most commonly assigned text, and then it'll also provide a list of the text that it's most frequently assigned with, and that was really useful for our purposes.
Syllabuses, what are some numbers here? How many syllabuses are there that are in the Open Syllabus project? How many do they have?
Well, of all the readings, it's about 15 million. So it's
15 million, but that's in all subjects all over the world, right?
That's right. That's right.
Well, that's a lot. It- I hate to ask this question because I have no idea if there's an answer to it. What percentage of all syllabuses in the world is that 15 million?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. Certainly, it's a substantial number, but it's true. It's not, it's a very large, of course, number, but we don't know for sure whether it's representative or how many total syllabuses there are in the world.
So if you how do you get your syllabus into this data set? If I wanted to get I don't know if mine's in there or not. I just have no idea. But
Yeah,
what do I have to do to make sure it's in there?
yeah. Well, you can send it to the person who runs this, right? So they're always eager for people to. They always want to expand the database. So I'd encourage listeners and you to do that, Paul. But base is scraped from the web. So that means there's a lot more syllabi from public universities than private ones. And but as I said, it's a pretty impressive data set.
So anybody who puts their syllabus up on the web for their students to be able to see it, and it's not in a protected university website, that
Yes.
syllabus is going to appear in this data set, probably.
Yes, yes,
And you're saying private universities are a little bit less likely to do that than public universities.
yes, that's correct. So it's biased toward public universities.
So, do you think these people are especially of a particular political leaning, or do you think you're getting a sort of not a particularly one right
Yeah.
wing or left wing lean to it?
Well, it's hard to know for sure, of course. I would say a few things. One is there's no particular reason to believe that publicly available syllabi are more sectarian than those that are not, right? In fact, if anything, it may be that those who, particularly in this moment, that those who particularly ideological or sectarian would be more reluctant to make their syllabi publicly available. Um, but it's also the case that, that our findings are so one-sided that it would be a little surprising if that a more comprehensive sample or a more representative sample would give us a dramatically different result. I think that's unlikely. And then the third thing I'd say is that there's other work now that's not being done by us, but by other scholars, which is pointing in a very similar direction, right? Coming up with pretty similar findings. And so I think that suggests there's a certain amount of convergent validity here. And I suspect as more work is done, I think whatever methodological doubts and questions you might raise about our paper will be less credible, right? And there'll be more of a sense and that syllabi are in fact pretty skewed, at least on the issues that most divide us.
Well, so let's dig into these three issues because I think if we look at each one of them, it'll show more clearly what you mean by the inclination to teach just one side of the subject. So let's
Right.
begin with this idea that we have a new racism, a new segregation, and it's the incarceration of Black Americans. And there's been, of course, a huge increase in incarceration in the last 30 years. And it's also true that the disproportionate are Black. So um, is this said to be a new form of segregation?
Yeah, so on this issue, we looked at Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which came out in 2010, and it was and it more than any other book, it helped inspire a kind of moral and political reckoning over race in the criminal justice system, right? It was a bestseller. It's been cited, tens of thousands of times at this point. And it became very popular in university courses, as it should, given its scholarly influence and given its public importance. So in the Open Syllabus database, it appears in more than 5,000 syllabi. That makes it among the most assigned books in the whole database. So it appears more often than Milton's Paradise Lost or Shakespeare's Hamlet. And
How come? Oh, no, no, no. It's not appearing more frequently than Shakespeare's Hamlet. I mean, at Paradise Lost, I was reading it the other day, and I was having some challenges. So I can see why it's, you got to have a good professor to teach that one. But Hamlet, I thought everybody read Hamlet.
well, not everybody, and Hamlet is often assigned. So it's not we don't mean to suggest that it's students aren't also reading books like by that are part of the canon. That's clearly the case. And if you're not familiar with Alexander's book, it essentially argued that mass incarceration is Jim Crow 2.0, right? It's a system that's intentionally designed to subjugate and control Black Americans. And so it was a very bold, provocative thesis, the kind that tends to generate a lot of academic controversy. And certainly it did. Alexander had lots of very important critics. The most important was and is James Foreman Jr. And if so, for listeners aren't familiar with him, he's a law professor at Yale. He's also the son of James Foreman Sr. And so, of course, Professor Foreman, the son, had a particular interest in the claim that Jim Crow, a system that his father had helped defeat, had been reborn, right? So he went to work almost immediately after the book was published. He wrote a working paper, he wrote a law review article, and then later he wrote a book called Locking Up Our Own, which argued that there was no racist conspiracy at the heart of mass incarceration. Yes, mass incarceration is a problem. It's a serious problem, but it's not one that was intentionally designed and created to subjugate Black Americans. Instead, it emerged because there was a big increase in crime and violence. And so Foreman's book was a great success. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a bestseller. It was an important book. And so one of the questions we asked is, how often is Alexander's book paired with critics like Foreman? What other works is Alexander taught with?
Sounds like a great question. I just love that question because, when I teach my classes, I teach a lot of court cases, and I'd like to have them learn what the majority said and then what the minority said. And I figure, okay, I've done my job here. They're getting both sides of this question. They can make up their mind. So that's what you're talking about here, right?
Yeah, we were
Let them
interested.
make up their mind.
Yeah, and are we exposing students to the scholarly controversy around these deeply contentious issues, right? Because these are complicated questions and the experts disagree, right? So to what extent are we exposing students to these disagreements? And we can report that the short answer is they're rarely exposed to these controversies. So take Foreman's Pulitzer Prize winning book, Locking Up Our Own. It's taught with Alexander about 3.5% of the time, right? It shows up almost never, really.
So I got to ask you, how do you this 3.5% is just an astonishing number.
Astonishing.
That means 97% or 96% of the time, the new Jim Crow book is taught without that important critique being presented at the same time. 96% of the time. I mean, that's just. But where are you getting that number from? How do you select the syllabuses that actually? Are you sure you've got them all?
What the Open Syllabus database provides it shows um, everything that the new Jim Crow is taught with. And so we can look at the most commonly assigned text with that book. And if you look at, I'd invite anyone who's curious to go do this yourself. Go to the Open Syllabus, type in the new Jim Crow, and you can see just the top 100 texts that are assigned with it. And you don't find, right, in that top 100, nearly all the assigned work with the new Jim Crow is work that doesn't really press against it in any serious way, right? So in fact, if you're like the three most commonly assigned texts with the new Jim Crow are works that, if anything, are really further to Alexander's left, right? You have works by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Michel Foucault, and the like, right? Those are the kinds of authors that are most frequently assigned with the new Jim Crow. The silver lining here, Paul, is that there is a minority of professors who really do teach the scholarly controversy around race in the criminal justice system, right? So there clearly are some professors who do this well. Unfortunately, they're just a small minority of the broader universe of professors who teach the controversy.
Well, could it be that the students pick it up in another class so that you've got, in one
Right.
class, you're going to get this, in another class, you're going to get another perspective, and the students put things together on their own?
Yeah, such a good question. We looked into this. So instead of starting with Michelle Alexander's book, we started with James Foreman's book, Locking Up Our Own. And precisely because we thought, well, maybe there's some other universe of courses that teach just a different orthodoxy, right? Maybe there's some universe of courses that are sort of anti-Alexander courses, right? That teach a more center left, more centrist perspective on this question. First of all, is that there aren't that many courses that teach the critical books in the first place, right? So it's a very small number of courses. Um, but those who do teach Foreman, right? Those who do teach Alexander's critics also tend to teach Alexander, right? And this goes to my point that I was making earlier, is that there is this group of professors that really do teach the controversy, right? And so that's encouraging, but there doesn't seem to be some universe of professors that are teaching some alternate orthodoxy and excluding Alexander, right? That doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, maybe it's just this one topic that tends to
Sure.
get this one-sided view. So let's go on to the Israeli question. You explore that in some depth in your paper and with your colleagues. So what's the main issue there, and who are the main writers in this space?
Yeah, this was a much more challenging issue to study for a couple reasons. First of all, there's on the narrow question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there wasn't a single canonical work as there was in the case of race in the criminal justice system, Michelle Alexander's sort of the center of that controversy, right? That's the work that gets assigned, that's the work everyone's reading, everyone's talking about. And so it has this huge gravitational power and force. Um, in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there wasn't so clearly um, a book that was quite as important, right? So that in fact we found about eight commonly assigned books on the controversy itself. They tended to share a common perspective, right? They tended to be critical of Israel and sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And so there was a small, so that's one universe of courses where students really bump into this issue. But then there was a larger universe of kind of critical theory courses where students encounter this issue as well, primarily through the work of Edward Said, who's been just extraordinarily influential. For those listeners who don't know Edward Said, he's a literary critic. He wrote a book called Orientalism, which created a kind of framework by which lots of intellectuals, particularly on the left, tend to understand it casts the West as sort of evil exploiters of the East, and it portrays Palestinians as the kind of um, exemplar of kind of Western rapaciousness and exploitation. So it's explicitly critical of Israel. Said himself is a Palestinian living in the West, so he is a sort of he's very much an activist on this issue. And so it was more challenging to study this, the way this controversy is
Let me
taught.
just ask about this a little bit
Sure.
more, because I haven't read this book, I have to confess, but
Yeah.
Orientalism, is the argument that the West views the Orient as inferior and that they
Yeah.
are, you know, not, they haven't achieved the same level of civilization as Western civilization. Is that his argument?
Yeah, that's sort of the essence of it, that right, it's backwards, it's irrational, it's religious, it's sort of caught in it exists out, it hasn't been touched by the Enlightenment.
You mentioned in your essay that Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization comes up on the other side of this question. And I have read that book. Actually, Sam,
Yeah,
an old friend of mine, and I was pleased to see that you recognized the significance of that work. Very controversial work, but it argued. I don't think he ever argued that the Orient is inferior, but he did
yeah,
say that
right,
there was really a clash of it's a different civilization, and these civilizations, their ideas and their practices are such that, that's where the wars of the future are going to be fought.
right,
I think he's actually done a
right.
pretty good job of predicting what's been happening, but
A
uh,
hundred percent. And I agree with you, Paul, 100%, right? He was not in to a degree, he agreed that sometimes the Arab world gets caricatured and misunderstood by Westerners, right? So in part, I think he wants to meet Seed at least part way. But he also clearly thinks that tensions between the West and the Arab world aren't just because we have irrational prejudices of, Arabs or Muslims, deep cultural and civilizational differences, and that it wasn't just an artifact of our irrational prejudices and superstitions.
so how frequently is the Said and Huntington texts, how frequently are they paired together?
Well, here again, it's the same story really. Huntington is very rarely assigned with Said. And indeed, Said is rarely assigned with any of his other critics as well, right? Generally, Said is taught with um, other fellow travelers of other eminent critical theorists like Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and the like. And so there again, I think we see, um, a kind of narrowing of the curriculum. And I think what's tragic about, in a way, Paul, is that it doesn't, it doesn't allow students to really take Said seriously. Because if we're really going to take Said seriously, let's hear from some of his most thoughtful and interesting critics, right? Let's hear from some texts that create some tension.
So how about the other way around? I mean, are there then a lot of courses that teach the other side of the question, and are they equally biased? What's the picture if you look at the sort of the Huntington literature? Is that being taught, or Bernard Lewis, for example? He's a distinguished
Yeah,
research
yeah.
scholar who was a
I mean,
critic.
Bernard Lewis is really important because Bernard Lewis was Said's most influential and important critic. Their conflict was well known. It was very public. It led to the division of Middle East studies, really sort of cut the whole field in half. And so it was incredibly polarizing within the discipline. Um, and but to answer your question, somebody like Lewis is very rarely taught with Said. But when Lewis is taught, which again isn't that often, but when he is taught, he's almost always assigned with Saeed. So he's frequently assigned with Saeed. So here again, you see the same sort of asymmetry, right? Where critics are rarely assigned with some dominant leftist text, but when the critics are taught, they usually are they usually are taught with other works that are in tension with their point of view.
But the other point that you're making here, as I hear the other point that you're making is that that really most of the courses that address these contentious issues are taking the sort of progressive left position, not the more moderate or to say nothing of a more conservative position.
No, that's exactly right. So they're taking the most they're treating the most leftist position on these issues as orthodoxies, right? As positions that should not be questioned or challenged. And you're right to say that, I mean, the big argument in the paper really is that, not every controversy, of course, needs to include conservatives, because sometimes in a particular controversy, conservatives are sort of scarce, right? They're just not important voices in the larger debate. And I would say that's broadly true of race in the criminal justice system and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Most of the combatants in those intellectual disputes are run from the far left to the sort of center left to maybe some centrists. There aren't a ton of conservatives. Obviously, abortion is a different case. There you have genuine conservatives. But there's a lot of marginalization and of voices that aren't really conservative. I mean, they are to the right of the most leftist texts, so they're conservative in that sense, but they're not in any other respect conservative.
So now let's move on. You mentioned the abortion issue as being somewhat
Yeah.
different, and that's what your paper suggests as well, and your article in the National Review makes the same point. But the abortion issue, you say, is a little bit more balanced.
Yeah.
But of course, that's been around for a long time, and so how's that being taught?
Yeah, that surprised us a little bit in the sense that we didn't expect it to be taught in a somewhat more balanced way. And here we looked at a famous essay by Judith Jarvis Thompson, who wrote a piece called "A Defense of Abortion" early in the 1970s. It was extremely influential. It's a great piece of philosophy. It's a text I've taught many times. And it really kind of staked out a sort of core pro-choice philosophical position, taught in conversation with critics more frequently than is the case in the other in the in than in race and mass incarceration or Israel and Palestine. Um, but there again, we see broadly the same asymmetry. That is, most professors don't really teach Thompson with pro-life critics, of which there have been plenty over the years. Um, Instead, the norm seems to be to teach it with, again, texts that don't press to, that don't really call into question sort of its deep assumptions. And so that, again, it's better. There's a there's a substantial minority of professors that really do teach the controversy over abortion. And that kind of surprised us in a way because it didn't seem obvious, at least going into this, that issue would be taught in a more balanced way or a less unbalanced way than the other controversies.
So what kinds of courses are the most one-sided? Being a political scientist, I'd like to think that the political scientists recognize there's always two sides to every question. So are they better than the humanities or history or what's, if you look divided up by field, which ones are the most, inclined to just preach one side
Yeah.
of the issue?
Yeah. Well, I think one reason abortion is taught in a more balanced way than some of the other issues is because it's mostly taught by philosophers, presumably philosophers of an analytic bent. And I think of the humanities, philosophy is a relatively healthy discipline in the sense that philosophers are a famously disagreeable lot. They like disagreement, they like arguments, and so I think you that partly explains why that issue is taught in a more in a more balanced way than some of the other issues. If you look at Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, that book is taught across a huge range of fields, including lots of fields that presumably have no expertise in crime or mass incarceration. So it's frequently taught, for example, in English literature courses, which was quite striking. It's taught in social work courses, are more politicized than philosophy is. Um, I don't know about political science. We just don't have enough good data to know, how political scientists teach some of these issues. I will say though that maybe I do suspect you're right though, Paul, that on the whole, political science is less politicized. We're less ideological than, say, sociology or history or certainly English literature. Um, but it may be that we also tend to retreat somewhat from teaching some of these controversies, and we leave it to disciplines that are more ideological, that are more activist. And so I think one corrective potentially to this problem is just to get more normie political scientists who might be otherwise busy teaching courses like Congress or parties or what have you, and get them to broaden their teaching and think about teaching some of these controversies.
So yes, that's my next question. What are the
Yeah.
policy implications? How would you correct this imbalance in our higher educational system?
Yeah, well, I persuade, many of the folks who are teaching in a very sectarian way to broaden and expand what they're doing. Maybe we can have some success here and there. I think that's possible. But I think the more hopeful possibility is we can get sort of normie social scientists to broaden their teaching, right? I just think that we actually need more courses on in these areas. We need more professors to decide to teach the issues that are most dividing and polarizing our country. And my suspect is that there's a kind of reluctance to do that, right? There's a kind of anxiety about wading into these kinds of questions. But I think it's just something we have to do. And I think once, there's more of us who are really teaching some of these controversies in broad, serious ways, it'll create a marketplace. And then students will have a choice, right? They can decide to, right, take the courses that are really ideological and dogmatic, or they can take the far more interesting, exciting, important courses that are teaching these questions in much more serious ways. Yeah.
There's quite a number of campuses now. They have these new programs in civic studies or civics education, or they have different names depending on where. There are a lot of state universities, Florida, Texas, North
Yeah.
Carolina, where they're, Ohio. They're, developing new programs. So is this a viable approach to this? Is that a mechanism by which you can achieve what you were just proposing?
Well, I think it's part of it. I mean, I think those programs, I'm a big supporter of them. I do think they diversify the faculty in important ways. They broaden the curriculum. My sense of them, though, is that they've expanded the curriculum in certain areas, right? So they're better at expanding the curriculum, and they're better. I think a lot of them, for example, have introduced courses on sort of the Western philosophical tradition. There's more great books being taught. There's more courses on foundational courses on American politics and constitutional law. My sense is that they could have more courses, though, that really do expose students to the most topical, timely, contentious issues. And I think they could perhaps do a bit more of that than they're doing. But I'm a huge supporter of these programs, and I think they're important. Having said that, it's also kind of limited, right? Because they're happening just in red states principally. And so that leaves lots of other places untouched by these reforms, right? So they're not a viable remedy for the problems at Columbia or the University of Chicago or Harvard. And I think at those institutions, again, we just need to find a way to get more professors who believe in liberal education, and I think there are a lot of them to weigh in and expand what they're teaching.
Well, thank you, John, for this paper along with your colleagues, and thank you for joining me on the Education Exchange with this fascinating summary of a very challenging issue.
Paul, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I've been speaking with Jon Shields. He's a professor at Claremont McKenna College. He's the co-author of a paper entitled Closed Classrooms: An Analysis of College Syllabi on Contentious Issues. This is available. John, where do you have this available currently?
Well, you can go to my website at CMC. It's linked there. It also appears in an abridged way on the most recent issue of National Affairs.
Thank you all for joining us on the Education Exchange today. I am Paul Peterson. Please join me every Monday at noon when our weekly podcast is released on the Education Next website.